Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on ecological weed management for organic production in the Western region. This is the second presentation in the Organic Farming and Soil Health in the Western U.S. webinar series. The series is organized by the Organic Farming Research Foundation and hosted by eOrganic with funding from Western SARE. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them on our website and on the eOrganic YouTube channel. This webinar will be presented by Mark Schoenbeck, who is a research associate at the Organic Farming Research Foundation. Mark has worked for the last 31 years as a researcher, consultant, and educator about organic and sustainable agriculture. He also works with the Virginia Association for Biological Farming.
All right. Welcome, everyone. A lot of these webinars started with a series of soil health guides, and before that, Organic Farming Research Foundation conducted a survey of over 1,000 organic farmers across the country, including 555 from respondents from the Western region, to identify research priorities. And within the Western region, weed management and soil health were among the top priorities. 71% of respondents said that soil health was a top priority, and 63% cited weed management. And there's a very challenging intersection of those two. What I have long called the organic farmer's dilemma: how to control weeds and maintain and improve soil health at the same time. The advantage to organic systems is we're not using any synthetic herbicides to manage weeds, and that maximizes the flexibility in the crop rotation. It also does protect soil life and water quality from any potentially harmful effects of the herbicides themselves. But most importantly, one of the most effective practices for soil health itself is to design crop rotations with a lot of diversity and a lot of biomass, a lot of plant growth activity year-round. And if you're not using herbicides, you don't have to worry about any residues in the soil when you go to select the next crop in your sequence. The challenge is that in lieu of herbicides, we have to rely on cultivation and tillage to some extent to keep the weeds from taking over. And every time you cultivate, there is a chance to stimulate new weed seeds to germinate because they respond to light and other tillage cues. And also, every time you disturb the soil, there is some loss of organic matter, and it can be harmful to soil life, especially the larger organisms like those visible earthworms and small insects in the soil that you can see. And also, the fungal networks tend to get broken up by that tillage. And then when the soil surface has been pulverized, it's more subject to crusting as well as erosion. Now, within the Western region, some specific priorities within the area of weed management included managing invasive perennial weeds, and we'll get into that in more detail later on. Crop rotations to decrease annual weed pressure, and the effects of different tillage regimes and plant and animal rotations on both soil health and the weeds themselves. Now, when I fixed this slide, somehow I accidentally got this next one twice, but it is a very interesting one. Using grazing and crop livestock integrated systems to help manage weeds. There's been some interesting research going on at Montana State University. We'll talk about that more later. And just in general, growers in the Western region are looking for more cost-effective approaches to weed control, both in terms of products used and other methods. And one interesting topic that came out was optical weeding technology, basically using various imaging tools and tactics right on the toolbar to help guide a precise removal of the weeds and, of course, leaving the crop standing. Okay, well, here are some of the lead problem weeds for Western region organic growers. Field bindweed, that's a picture of a field bindweed in flower. I unfortunately couldn't get a hold of any really good pictures of the weed in its typical rampant behavior of covering the ground, climbing both annual and perennial crops, and making itself a terrible nuisance. Canada Thistle is another leading weed problem, another invasive perennial that spreads by underground creeping rhizomes and roots. Yellow nutsedge similarly spreads by tubers. More of a problem in irrigated or high moisture areas. And then in the lower right-hand corner, a couple of the annual weeds that are typically found to be a problem in crop rotations in the region. So we'll just kind of take a quick pass through what I call Weed Ecology 101, what makes weeds happen. And basically, weeds are pioneer plants that are adapted to coming up quickly and covering the ground when there's been a disturbance. And this could be a wildfire or an avalanche or like a mudslide, or it could be human activities like clear cutting or simply tilling up a field. You now have exposed soil. So the first thing that tends to happen is these pioneer plants pop up real quickly to cover the ground, begin to protect it from erosion, begin to restore organic matter lost during the disturbance, etc. So when you've got open soil and then let nature take its course, most typically you will get this progressive coverage of the soil by weeds. And really, that's not all bad, because the alternative is worse. You wait for a heavy rain on this soil and it can look like this or worse. So in a sense, weeds are performing a very important ecological function. And it's particularly true when soil is disturbed by a natural event or by a clear cut in which we do not intentionally plant something immediately afterwards. Cropland weeds are adapted to a particular kind of disturbance, basically fairly regular, predictable tillage at certain times of the year or at certain intervals, combined with relatively high fertility soils. And so they're adapted to this kind of disturbance, and they germinate and pop up quickly in response to those tillage cues, which can include the light flash that occurs when a tillage implement moves through the soil. Other things that happen is by breaking up the soil surface and aerating it, you're increasing the oxygen levels and reducing levels of carbon dioxide. Also, when the tillage removes vegetation or residue cover, the temperature fluctuations in the surface layers get wider. And another thing that happens is you tend to stimulate mineralization and release of nutrients. So these cropland weeds are specifically adapted to responding to and absorbing those readily available nutrients. And they also reproduce prolifically either by seed or by those underground rhizomes, tubers, and roots, which are characteristic of the invasive perennial weeds. So another way in which humans create weeds is bringing plants in from another part of the world, plants that are not native to our region. And we'll look at a lot of the weeds that have turned up as major problems in the Western region or elsewhere. And although some of them are indeed from this continent, the pigweeds, some of which are very aggressive, and also common cocklebur, are native to North America. But we look at Canada Thistle, and I put that Canada in quotes because it's really from Europe and Asia. And the reason it is such a pest in this country is that we don't have the native natural checks and balances that this particular thistle encounters in Europe. We have our own native thistles, which are themselves kept in check by our suite of soil organisms and insects. And on the other hand, they tend to get displaced by the Canada Thistle. Field bindweed likewise, yellow nutsedge, lamb's quarters and Johnson grass are actually brought over on purpose. Lamb's quarters because it's a very nourishing green, just as nutritious as kale and broccoli. And Johnson grass is an excellent forage. And however, when they get into the systems where you're not particularly wanting to grow lamb's quarters and Johnson grass, they become weeds. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to look at weeds in relation to the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Services 4 principles of soil health management. And you all may be quite familiar with this, or some of you anyway. But since about 2011, NRCS has had a soil health initiative nationwide, and they've advanced these 4 key principles: keeping the soil covered with either living vegetation or at least sufficient crop residue or organic mulch to protect the surface; diversifying crops, that you're building the soil diversity and the soil ecosystem through a diversity of plants either grown together or in succession in a good rotation. One of the principles that's emerging as highly important is maintaining living roots throughout the soil profile as much of the year as possible. And then the 4th one is minimizing disturbance. And at first, this was really looked at as basically no-till. And while reducing tillage is vitally important, it is also important to consider chemical disturbances that can arise from very high levels of available plant nutrients, or heavy use of pesticides can create a chemical disturbance. And then there's biological disturbances such as overgrazing, which can lead to compaction, or in a different sense, the arrival of invasive plants, certain weeds. So weeds actually benefit a number of these principles. Weeds are really nature's cover crop. They do restore cover after a disturbance, and they'll put down those living roots pretty quickly. And if you have a reasonably diverse weed flora, you can actually be restoring some diversity to the soil. And in one way that they can actually help ease the effects of disturbance is they do the cropland and weed up nutrients very rapidly. So if you have a flush of excess nitrate from rapid mineralization and the weeds take it up, you will have less damage to water quality, and you will reduce the subtle adverse effects of very high nutrient levels on soil life itself. However, there are some drawbacks, besides the fact that if the weeds are in the way, it's hard to grow a crop, make a living. I mean, that's the obvious drawback. But there are some more subtle ones. So these invasive exotic weeds, they displace native plants through a number of mechanisms. One is they can be highly competitive for soil moisture. This is particularly problematic in areas with limited rainfall, such as the northern Great Plains and the desert Southwest, interior parts of California, Oregon, and Washington as well. And in some cases, there's clear evidence that these invasive exotics directly disrupt indigenous soil biota. There's an example from hardwood forests, a small perennial herb related to cabbage, which is called garlic mustard. And in its native lands in Europe, it's just a harmless understory plant that, grows in forests but doesn't really cause much trouble. However, its root exudates are very toxic to the mycorrhizal fungi on which New World hardwoods depend. So there is evidence that if garlic mustard is allowed to grow unchecked as an understory, it will slowly but surely supplant entire mature hardwood forests. There are several weeds of rangeland that also undermine both the indigenous flora and also take a lot of soil moisture. And then some of them simply compete directly with the native vegetation. And in all those ways, they're reducing diversity. Okay, so put some of this weed ecology into practice. How do we get the most weed control with the least soil damage? This is the question that keeps organic farmers awake all night, and keeps organic matter from increasing, is what I meant to say there. So yes, it has impact on both, and let's see if there's ways to look at approach this. The key to this is to take a many little hammers approach. In conventional agriculture, a lot of weed management depends upon one big hammer, that's the herbicides, which can actually facilitate no-till, eliminating that physical disturbance in conventionally managed systems. And the first step in going organic is you got to put away the sprayer. What do you do about the weeds? You bring out the steel, cultivation and tillage. If that becomes the big hammer, that's when soil health will really suffer. However, as Dr. Fabian Manalid says here in this quote, that achieving both soil health and good weed management in an organic system requires this ecological approach where you use many different tactics, each of which alone has only a little impact, but when they're done all together, will keep the weeds under control. And one of the things is to know when to go after the weeds and when to let them be for a time being. Like right here, this cabbage crop is well established. There are tiny weeds in there. And on the one hand, those weeds are not going to interfere with cabbage yield. However, on the other hand, you do want to keep an eye on them. If they get anywhere close to flowering, you're going to want to take care of them. Most likely, these weeds will flower just about when the cabbage harvest is coming in. And that means you need to be prompt about doing something to at least mow down those weeds and minimize the seed set. So the first strategy is just to get to know the weeds you have. For example, one very broad distinction between weed seedlings, the broadleafs, the dicots, they have the growing point above ground. And when they're very tiny like this, it's very easy to take them out with a very, very shallow cultivation or even just flame. You don't need to till up this ground vigorously to get rid of those tiny weeds. But over here with the grasses at the same age, that growing point is still below ground, about a ½ inch under the soil. So again, you don't need to plow that land to deal with those little tiny grasses, but you do need to go in with some cultivation that goes about 1 inch deep and really knocks those weeds out. Another thing you want to know about your weeds is life cycle and season, what particular weeds prefer in terms of their growth requirements and germination cues. It's usually a combination of light and the other tillage cues I mentioned, but it can vary from weed to weed. But let's look at some more examples. Common purslane. The thing about common purslane is you can go through and cultivate that. You can take that out and leave it on the surface, and it's so drought adapted that even without additional rainfall, it can reroot and resume growth. But it does have a weak point. Once the corn crop, you see there's a little corn coming up here, once that corn gets about 4 feet tall and shades the ground, the purslane is very intolerant to shade, becomes very susceptible to diseases. So in a tall crop, this is probably not likely to be a serious weed problem. Okay, here are some of these perennial weeds that spread by underground roots and have these tremendous underground reserves. That's actually hedge bindweed. It's not the field bindweed that is the greatest problem in the western region, but it is quite a spectacular and troublesome weed in parts, more humid climates such as Virginia, where I'm from. But the trick with these is, you know from experience, I'm sure, that if you till up perennial weeds, you make thousands of babies. I mean, every one becomes 10. You chopped up each little piece, then regrows. But when it starts to regrow, it's having to use the reserves underground. So if you catch it at about the 3-leaf stage, before it starts to rebuild its reserves, you can actually significantly weaken that stand. So basically, you've created a whole bunch of fairly weak, vulnerable plants, and you don't have to till very deep, but you do have to till deep enough to sever the top growth from the underground parts, and that will weaken it. Sometimes you have to do that for 2 or 3 cycles. And yes, there is a cost to soil health to be doing that. However, when you have a bad infestation, or maybe perhaps you didn't even realize you had a bad infestation until you tilled and found all these little fragments coming up. The trick is to hit them at this stage. Okay, another strategy is to preempt the weeds. That's what cover crops do. Cover crops are basically those crops that perform the vital ecological functions of pioneer plants, but they do so with lots of biomass and at the same time are a lot easier to manage than weeds. Another trick is to intercrop, like this farmer here, this high tunnel grower, planted tomatoes, which start kind of slowly, and lettuce and bok choy greens on either side of the tomato, and they grew quickly, covering the ground, suppressing the weeds, and providing a crop while the tomato was getting established. So that instead of hoeing weeds, they were harvesting a marketable crop. Here's another example of strip tillage. This is where a rye cover crop was grown over winter, and then instead of tilling the whole field, the farmer mowed the rye crop and then just took a small walk-behind rototiller to work up the rows for the tomato plants. And this way, instead of having a bunch of weeds in the interrows, we have a cover crop that, as the weather gets hotter and hotter, is going to tend to naturally die out, and at most will need one more mowing with a push mower. Here's another example: relay interplanted cover crops. This is in a very cold part of the country with a zone 4A, so it's a very short growing season. And the farmer there sows the clover once the vegetable crop is established. And then at vegetable harvest, the clover is ready to grow and cover the ground for the winter. Cover cropping, just a few tricks about using cover crops for optimal weed control. You want really rapid early growth, canopy closure, and you want to select crops that have those properties. Buckwheat is an excellent example. Another one is cowpeas. They cover the ground pretty quickly. Some of the millets, oats are pretty quick at covering the ground, etc. Oh, radish, that's really important one. In addition to its deep taproot, it is very effective at covering the ground quickly after seeding. So when you do a mix, you want to include at least one cover crop that has those properties. And for instance, if you're growing a winter cover crop like rye and vetch, and those seedlings may take a while to get going, you might mix in a little bit of oats or buckwheat that will come up more quickly and provide some fall weed suppression. And then in colder areas, the winter frost will take those out. Of course, with buckwheat, any light frost will take it out. So there's some possibilities there. And also, when you combine cover crops with complementary growth habits, like here you have rye, which is tall, and then you have vetch and peas, which have broader leaves and they tend to be climbing, that combination shades the ground and occupies the niche more thoroughly. And the other thing that's important is to provide optimum conditions. Optimize your seeding rate, the method. Planting date is real critical. And sometimes it makes sense to water or fertilize a cover crop to ensure that it provides the weed control and soil health services that you're looking for. Most cover crops are quite forgiving. So you put down a little bit of raw or aged manure. It's a good time in the rotation because you don't have to worry about food safety when you're growing a 4, 6, 8 month cover crop ahead of your next vegetable. Good time for uncomposted manure. Again, being careful that you don't have a lot of weed seeds in the manure or herbicide residues, etc. And also a one-time irrigation right after seeding, if you're planting into dry soil, can really make all the difference to getting a good stand. So this is what I call keeping the weeds guessing. Create a crop rotation that will really mix it up. Cool and warm season crops, deep-rooted versus shallow-rooted, different growth habits, alternating different nutrient use patterns, and perhaps rotating annual cropland into perennial sod for a couple of years will often be very effective in breaking up weed life cycles, reducing weed seed banks. I will add a caveat, which we'll get into more later, that these perennial sod crops may not be the best choice in limited rainfall regions as part of a rotation with annual crops, and we'll talk about that more a little later. However, where rainfall is sufficient, there's been extensive research, and every study has shown that having one or more years in clover, or better yet, clover plus grass to get a real balance or a diverse mixture, both builds soil fertility and soil health and reduces annual weed seed banks and annual weed pressure. Another thing you want to rotate is when you till, when you plant, when you harvest, all the field operations, and your method and depth of tillage. And if conditions permit, throw in some rotational no-till, roll down a cover crop if you have the equipment and the experience. And then also vary how you control the weeds. You don't want to use just the same tools or the same materials every year, because the weeds will get used to anything you do over and over. So this is the end statement by Dr. Manala. This is a really excellent bulletin on from conventional to organic cropping, what to expect during the transition years. I highly recommend it. It's available with the Montana State Extension. And he considers crop rotation as the core of organic weed management. And that's quite an important statement for dry land production and semi-arid regions, because very often the traditional rotation is a year of wheat or other cereal grain and a year of fallow, which may be managed by tillage or herbicides. If it's not managed, the weeds will just come in and just take up all the moisture that you're trying to save with fallow. But either tillage or herbicides will leave the soil bare, and the soil health will suffer quite severely. And there are certain weeds that will defeat that system too. However, when you have the good crop rotation, it's much more effective in keeping certain weeds from getting out of control. There's one study that showed that if you have a field bindweed patch, if it's maintained in fallow with tillage, as an organic farmer would have to do, that patch will grow tenfold over the course of a year. Whereas growing just about any crop, whether it's wheat or whether it's a warm season oilseed or a legume crop, that approach tends to keep the bindweed patch from growing very much. Okay, well, here's a nice diverse rotation. And then you look at that and you say, wow, it sure meets keeping that soil covered. It meets building biodiversity. You see all those crops in that rotation. They're vigorous. There's a good amount of biomass. Don't see a lot of bare soil. And yet, there could be certain summer annual weeds that start to drive the farmer nuts in this rotation. And that's because they're all summer vegetables, and they're all planted into tilled seed beds, and that tillage occurs the same time every year. So there's a uniformity, a predictability of the disturbance that soil undergoes. Another little refinement I would suggest to this rotation, in addition to trying to break up this predictability, is you see there's a rye cover crop here ahead of cucumber, and then crimson clover, which is a legume, ahead of lima bean, which is also a strongly nitrogen fixing legume. One trick I would start with is take this rye, put it up here ahead of the lima bean, because the rye will tend to tie up soil nitrogen, and the nitrogen responder weeds will be growing weakly, if at all, after a rye cover crop, especially if you roll down the cover crop and plant the lima bean with strip till or no till. But in any case, this is a strong nitrogen fixer and will get that much more of an edge over the weeds. So here's another example of a diversified rotation where we really mix it up a bit so that make it even harder for the weeds to deal with the constant shifting patterns of disruption. For instance, we still have 3 vegetable crops in this rotation. We get potatoes, winter squash, and then a fall crop of lettuce, or actually a spring crop the following year, excuse me. We still include some tillage because continuous no-till is very difficult to do in organic annual crop rotations. And instead of having a vegetable crop, we've substituted a winter cereal for grain. It could be a specialty crop. Here it's just rye, but it could be a specialty barley or kamut or whatever. And then the thing about these cereal grains is you can overseed the red clover right into them, and the red clover will get established. You can grow that for a year or so. Maybe want to mix some grass in with it. And then you will need to do some kind of tillage to terminate that perennial. Potatoes like to follow red clover. And then the potatoes, once you've dug them, the soil has been tilled just by the process of digging. But that's at a different time of year. So then you can get that fall cover crop in, etc. So another strategy is to just do everything you can to make your crops vigorous and competitive. And here's a couple of examples of how that can happen. I mean, the first thing is you want to maintain healthy, fertile soil, but not overly fertile. You don't want the soil to have really high levels of soluble nutrients, and yet you want to ensure that there's enough soil life and enough nutrients to sustain healthy, vigorous crops. And then you want to choose your crops so that you get the soil covered really quickly. And that can be both cultivar selection and management. This cultivar of carrot is one that we like here in our part of the country. I'm not sure how well it would do in the West. It's called Danvers 126. And you can see it forms a nice, thick, large top so that it needs one or two fewer hoeings than most other carrot varieties to get it established and ahead of the weeds. And there is an excellent OREI-funded project called Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture. And they've been working, it's a farmer participatory breeding project that has been doing trials in Oregon and California, as well as elsewhere across the nation. And they are working on, they have some advanced breeding lines that combine excellent flavor and market qualities with weed competitiveness and, very importantly, disease resistant. The one drawback of this variety that I show in the picture is that it's rather susceptible to a couple of major carrot diseases. But this new project is coming out with cultivars that combine this weed competitive trait with disease resistance and good market quality. Sweet potatoes, if you plant them at a time when the soil is good and warm, they will cover the ground real quickly, need very little weed control, maybe one early season hoeing, and then your canopy looks like that. Another example of growing competitive crops is season extension. You want an early bean crop. Instead of planting them in cold soil and letting them struggle against the cool adapted weeds of spring, put a low or high tunnel and a row cover over it to create some season extension, warm up the soil. Then you get a really well-established crop. Another strategy that's really important in vegetable production is just transplanting. When you set out plants that are already 6 or 8 inches tall, you get a 4 to 6 week jump on the weeds. So much so that many organic growers will transplant all their cucurbits, and that takes a little more care and skill than tomatoes, but I have both had and seen very good success with that. And some growers even transplant beets. It sounds kind of crazy, but I've tried that myself, and it also works. So, especially when weeds are a big issue, it can pay. One thing to remember is that healthy soil tends to favor crops over weeds, and there are certain weeds that will get worse. They proliferate when there are soil health problems, such as poor drainage. Here, yellow nutsedge tends to come up in the wet parts of the field. Further back, it's better drained. And yes, there's yellow nutsedge, but it's not taking over back there. This is really interesting to me. This is at a very sandy soil on a vegetable farm. And the pigweed popped up in the footprints because the soil is compacted there, and those tiny seeds are more able to come up in a compacted soil surface, whereas when the soil surface is loose and open, of course, it favors both crop and soil health. Another strategy that's important to remember is you feed the crop, not the weeds. In-row drip irrigation is an opportunity both to get the water just selectively to the crop and also fertigation. There are some organic fertilizers that can be used through the drip. I have heard both successes and some problems with these materials because they can clog, but it is a tactic to keep in mind. Another thing is just to band your fertilizer right in the row. On another topic, compost is a good source of slow-release nutrients. And the thing is, if you're using a nutrient-rich compost, you want to use it in moderation. And the next slide will show the reason why. Remember I said cropland weeds are those pioneer plants that respond to high levels of nutrients. This is a very interesting, this is a conceptual diagram based on some very interesting studies. Now, granted, outside the Western region, it was at Cornell. However, I think it has nationwide applicability, and it's worth keeping in mind. This was a compost rate. It was a very high analysis compost, poultry litter. It was something like 452, which is unusually high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. So nitrogen responder weeds, nutrient responder weeds, such as lamb's quarters and pigweed and foxtails and ragweed, will respond to nitrogen from organic sources as well. And the interesting thing is they looked at both field crops and vegetables, and this was the response. And this is 1.0 is the recommended rate based on the soil test for that particular high analysis compost. And the crop responded up to that 1.0 rate, and then its yield leveled off. That's true for for field corn and for kale, which are two examples of quite heavy feeding crops that you would expect to respond quite strongly to nitrogen. The weed response, these are several weeds, including the lamb's quarters, velvet leaf, ragweeds, and I believe foxtails. The weeds responded with ever increasing growth up to at least twice the recommended rate. Another thing to remember is that the majority of our crops, especially legumes, grains, and cucurbit family and onion family, oh, excuse me, tomato family and onion family, those 4 plant families especially are highly responsive to mycorrhizal fungi. They form highly effective associations, and the mycorrhizae help these crops obtain nutrients, moisture, and to ward off diseases. Most of our most serious cropland annual weeds, on the other hand, are non-mycorrhizal, and they will tend to proliferate on very high nutrient levels, because instead of relying on mycorrhizae to help them get nutrients, they just wait for the soluble nutrients to come along. And the mycorrhizal fungi will go dormant once your phosphorus level is above optimum. So if you put on too much of that 4,5,2, you will shut these very beneficial fungi down and will reduce your crop's advantage over the weeds. And as I mentioned earlier in that crop rotation example, you get a strong nitrogen fixer like soybean, manage for low soil soluble nitrogen. Actually, just manage for tying up nitrogen somewhat, and then the soybean will fix its own nitrogen and it'll get a really big running start on weeds. In fact, one of the most successful versions of organic no-till, or applications, I should say, of organic no-till is soybean planted after a rye or other cereal grain cover crop has been grown to late flowering or early seed set, and then roll crimped, creating the surface mulch and a low soluble soil nitrogen condition. Plant the soybeans in there, and very often especially in the central and southern half, central to southern 2/3 of the country, where summers are reasonably hot, the soybean will give full yield and will need much less weed control. And that's in large part because of that nitrogen advantage. Another thing you want to do is cultivate effectively. It's a matter of selecting tools carefully. I don't want to dwell on this too long. Just a couple of comments. If you cultivate shallowly when the weeds are very, very tiny like this, it's highly effective and you're doing much less soil disturbance. I'm not an equipment person myself. I just wanted to mention that there is a large and growing diversity of really sophisticated tools and combination of tools available to growers for cultivation. And they're designed to maximize the weed control efficacy and minimize disruption to the soil profile. eOrganic, the weed management area of the eOrganic website, part of the extension website, has a number of excellent videos that will give you much more information on this aspect of weed management. And when possible, use alternatives to cultivation. Mowing between crop rows can be quite effective when the crop is established. I almost want to take flame weeding off of there in the wake of this really tragic wildfire. So I wanted to point out that hot water or steam is a safer way to thermally control weeds, especially if you have any residues or it hasn't rained very much. And mulch, this could be organic mulch, such as hay or leaves or straw, or it can be black plastic film, which does have the drawback that it's a fossil fuel resource and you have to remove it at the end of the season. There are also other synthetic mulches. Weed mat or landscape fabric is much more effective because it can be used either for a perennial crop or reused for up to 10 or more years for different annual crops. A couple of techniques related to synthetic mulches. Solarization. I know of at least one farmer has been highly successful mowing a cover crop at maturity and ensuring its termination by just solarizing for a couple of hot summer days under clear plastic. And after that, there was really good nitrogen mineralization for a heavy feeding crop, broccoli and cauliflower. Occultation is another approach. You could do this with old silage tarps or black plastic mulch or weed fabric, the weed mat. And you leave that in place for a few weeks to ensure cover crop termination, and it really chokes out the weeds too. And you get a longer weed-free period after no-till planting your production crop. NOP allowed herbicides, I would consider them a very small hammer. They're not highly effective. The one strategy here that is most likely to be applicable to moderate to larger scale is livestock grazing after harvest. That could be one way to take care of those weeds that are about to flower, like that cabbage crop I showed earlier. If you fast forward ahead to cabbage harvest and you have the cabbage residue in the field and you have a bunch of weeds that are just about ready to start setting seed, one possibility is to turn the cows or the chickens or the goats out on there and let them have at it, and that will greatly reduce your weed seed burden. The big challenge here is the weed seed bank. If your soil has got gazillion weed seeds in it, because previous years crops were allowed to set seeds, it can be very frustrating. You can have the best early season cultivation protocol, the best rotation, et cetera, and you can still get big crops of weeds coming up like this. And another challenge, a related challenge, is with the creeping perennial weeds. This is yellow nutsedge for an example. Long before the yellow nutsedge will flower, and it does make some seeds with its flowers, so it's reproducing many different ways. Long before it's ready to flower, it's already spreading underground by these lateral roots. You can see them very easily in this dug out section of yellow nutsedge. Early in the season, the plant will tend to form daughter plants off of those rhizomes. Late in the season, it forms tubers that overwinter and come back next year. So how do we deal with this kind of situation? We can bait the weeds. I like to call it baiting the weeds, because you create a seed bed. You say, okay, I'm going to pretend that I'm preparing a seed bed to plant tomorrow. And then you walk away for a few days until the weeds are just coming up. And then this is a time where you don't have to stir up the whole soil profile in order to take those weeds out. You could take those out with flame if they're mostly broadleaf, or you can take them out with a very shallow cultivation and then immediately plant. Or if you have a really heavy weed seed bank, you can do that 2 cycles. In this case, the farmer has planted a cover crop by broadcasting just with a simple hand crank spin seeder, and is now running the rototiller just 1 inch deep, taking out these little weeds and planting the cover crop at the same time. It's been highly effective. Okay, and this is another thing that several research projects have shown has been very interesting. If you have a cover crop that winter kills, you're growing pearl millet and you get the first frost and it dies down, or you're growing radish and you're in a region that'll go down below 15 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to freeze out. Leave the residues in place. Don't ever be in a hurry to get out there and turn them under, because in these situations, the ground beetles and the field mice and everything else will be eating any weed seeds that have rained down during the course of the season. And also, delaying tillage has been shown to improve soil health and even crop yield in the following crop. Okay, another thing you can do is you got some weeds, you got some weedy pasture or some cropland, and you need some weed control. Sometimes you can just use it for grazing. Just turn the weeds into organic animal products. That can be on crop residues at the end of the season, as I mentioned. Grazing cover crops can be quite effective. Or if you do have a perennial sod in your sod phase in your crop rotation, you can be making some money on that by rotationally grazing it. And management-intensive rotational grazing itself is an excellent management practice against pasture and rangeland weeds, because what happens is, if you have the animals confined to a small area and they graze really intensively for a day or two, and then they're moved off, they graze everything down. They don't have time to be picky and say, well, I'll eat that juicy grass and I'll leave that pigweed alone and never mind the bindweed. They'll just come through and eat anything that's not highly toxic, and they'll trample the rest, and then they move off, and all your desirable grasses will have time to grow back, because in the rotational system, you allow full recovery. And that also improves soil health and forage quality. Okay, now we get on to some specific challenges for the Western region. One of the biggest, and I'm actually on a learning curve on this. I'm from Appalachian region of Virginia, where we get 45 inches of rain a year. So it's been fascinating to learn about growers such as Bob Quinn, who can make a living growing excellent crops of oil seeds, pulses, dry beans, lentils, and cereal grains on as little as 10 or 15 inches a year. The challenges here are that weeds really consume, their biggest drawback is they consume precious soil moisture. And in these situations, the invasive perennial weeds, notably bindweed and Canada Thistle, are especially hard to manage because their deep, extensive root systems are very difficult to take out with tillage. And because the soils are already rather low on organic matter and tend to be somewhat thin, they're easily degraded by cultivation and tillage, very prone to wind erosion. And cover crops, which in higher rainfall regions are, the number one strategy for soil health and against weeds, they themselves can hurt grain yields by taking too much soil moisture. So they have to be selected and managed with great care. And in these regions, organic reduced tillage is actually more difficult than in wetter regions because the crop then finds itself kind of in the double bind of dealing with the weeds and the limited moisture. So organic weed management strategies, taking from that general list, most of them really apply. It's especially important to maintain a really good crop rotation and to grow crops that will be competitive during their life cycle against the weeds, tall height, rapid canopy closure, etc. Nutrient management is also critical. Turns out that wild oat, which is a weed of cereal grains, is one of those nitrogen responders. So if you give more nitrogen, you apply more nitrogen than is really necessary for the wheat crop, you will give the wild oats an advantage. Flame weeding, it's been recommended in some of these bulletins, but I would put that big question there about fire danger again. Cover crops and mulches, when used properly, really critical to manage the weed seed bank, and an integrated approach to perennial weeds. Now, the other strategy I've drawn a line through here, perennial forages, that's because when you introduce a perennial phase into an annual crop rotation, it does consume a lot of moisture. And if you're actually harvesting the forage and baling it off and selling it as hay or feeding it elsewhere outside of that field, you're also extracting quite a few nutrients. However, if you graze the forage, of course, the nutrients mostly recycle in place. The other thing that now in Montana State University, the researchers there have found that the moisture depletion from a perennial forage phase in the rotation can lead to reduced yields for more than 1 year, several years in subsequent annual production crops. Another thing that tends to happen is when that sod is broken to plant your next annual crop, there can be quite severe infestations by both perennial and annual weeds. So this is I like the title of this new OREI project award, Creep Stop. It's an integrated weed management project covering both the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Great Plains, aimed at these perennial weeds, especially Canada Thistle and field bindweed, both of which have been cited as sometimes potential game stoppers for organic farmers and transitioning organic farmers, make it extremely difficult for both dryland grain production and production of some woody horticultural crops such as vineyard or orchard. This project is integrating a number of different weed control strategies. Biological control is a key part of it, a rust fungus against the thistle and a bindweed gall mite, changing the crop rotation again to disrupt the life cycle, strategic use of mowing, grazing. One thing I wanted to point out is that these two regions, the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Great Plains, have different patterns of rainfall. So their total rainfall may be similar in the 10 to 15 inch range, but in the Pacific Northwest, almost all of it comes in the winter. And in Montana, at least half of it comes during the warmer months as thunder showers. So those will create some differences in what cover crops and rotations would work best. Another project is looking at biocontrol for field bindweed in the perennial horticultural crops. This cute little moth over here is something called field bindweed moth, which has been described as both voracious feeder on bindweed and also quite specific. So it isn't going to turn around and eat non-target native plants and crops and such. The project is working on developing natural attractants to invite this moth to into the bindweed infested parts of the field. They're also looking at the bindweed gall mite. They're setting up farmer participatory trials, and they've already had some interesting results. A steam weeding system where they run the steam weeder at 250 degrees Fahrenheit and with a slow tractor forward motion. That gave the best knockdown control. It removed nearly all of the above ground biomass of the bindweed. And no, it doesn't kill the whole 30-foot deep root system, but it certainly weakens it to have that that kind of treatment be applied in a strategic way, especially when integrated with these other parts of the IPM approach. There's the project website, eOrganic info/bindweed. I'm sure that the site will have much more information as the project moves forward. Another award this year to the Colorado State Department of Agriculture, working with organic farmers, looking at rust fungus as a biocontrol. This is that rust fungus I mentioned earlier. The interesting thing is that so-called Canada Thistle is this invasive exotic from Eurasia, but the Puccinia punctiliformis, the rust fungus, is native to the United States or to North America. So it was like there was a biocontrol actually waiting for this particular invasive weed. It was awaiting discovery. And this is a really excellent project plan, because in addition to evaluating its efficacy and its interaction with other farm management practices, such as irrigation, tillage, and midsummer mowing is another one, they're going to be training producers in how to identify the fungus in the field, to collect it, and grow up their own inoculum and reapply it to their most infested patches in the next season. And they will also be providing farmers with inoculum as the project moves forward. Now, this is some information from outside the region, but I think it may be useful, at least in some parts of the area where a sorghum Sudan grass cover crop would work. Canada Thistle is suppressed directly by sorghum Sudan grass, both by sheer competition. You can see the tremendous biomass over here. And at the same time, it's also, the sorghum Sudan will release a allelopathic chemical called sorgoleone, to which Canada Thistle is at least somewhat sensitive. In addition, even without a cover crop, if this thistle is allowed to grow until it has about 7 to 12 leaves and the flower buds are just emerging, it's quite tall, and then it's cut back or undercut at the soil surface, it does set it back some because it has a lot of its energy above ground. So the integrated strategy is to grow sorghum Sudan as a cover crop where you have a thistle infestation, and you'll get this thistly cover crop, and you mow it down, and what happens is cutting the sorghum Sudan at that stage just stimulates its growth. I mean, it sends roots deeper, and the root mass gets much larger, and you have massive tillering. You have a really dense regrowth of the top growth. And doing that has been found to reduce the populations of Canada Thistle in the next year's soybean crop by 98% compared to all the other strategies, including buckwheat cover crops and mowing alone. So it may be interesting to integrate this tactic into at least some applications in the Western region, along with the rust fungus and the other strategies that are under investigation. Okay, so again, going back to the team in Montana State, they're looking at different ways to integrate livestock into crop production systems in order to improve management of perennial weeds. Right here is just the first example that they looked at was poultry, and this is actually in vegetable production in these circumstances. I wasn't clear whether it was an irrigated system or not. Probably was, but in any case, they planted a winter cover crop, and they tried grazing the poultry at a population of about 30 hens per 10 by 10 chicken tractor. It was a small scale chicken tractor type application. And they grazed the cover crop down in one day, took it off for 2 weeks, during which the cover crop regrew really well, put the chickens back on one more time to graze it back down, and then took them off. And what happened is the poultry left a lot of extra fertility in the form of manure, and by interrupting weed growth twice, they prevented the weeds from setting seed, even though they did not reduce weed biomass. And meanwhile, the cover crop biomass doubled. So you had a greater input of organic matter and nitrogen, which then in turn increased vegetable yields. In another experiment, they had a 5-year grain rotation in which at one phase the rotation included a sweet clover cover crop, which was they used sheep to graze it down and compared that with simply tilling it. And after the clover, they grew winter wheat and then a legume and then another winter wheat. And I believe the clover was the sweet clover was overseeded into an oil seed. But what they found, though, in this case, the grazing system wasn't nearly as successful. Where they grazed the cover crop, the weed levels increased, the weed flora shifted, and if it was a wet year, the sheep running on the field and grazing down the sweet clover compacted the soil, and this reduced the subsequent wheat yields of the wheat and the lentil crops that followed, especially when there was that compaction. So the research team has been working with a number of farmers to look at some ways to improve the rotation. And so they redesigned the rotation to have a higher diversity and grow some intercrops and to increase competition against weeds, like instead of growing safflower, which wasn't that strongly competitive, they're growing a mustard oil seed, a mustard being brassica and covering the ground quickly. It was more competitive. Another interesting thing they did is they overseeded foxtail millet into the sweet clover. So you had two overseedings, the sweet clover into the mustard, the foxtail millet into the sweet clover. And having that millet there somehow lessened the compaction, probably the grass root biomass, having the very fibrous root system of the grass cover crop probably eased the compacting effect of the grazing. And I just wanted to mention Villicus Farms in Havre, Montana, Doug and Anna Crabtree. They have developed an incredibly diverse system using 10 different cover crops and 15 different production crops. And here are actually 2 production crops grown as an intercrop, camet or Carzon wheat and flax, which can be harvested together and very easily separated during cleaning because the seeds are very different in size, shape, and density. So another thing that the Crabtrees and some other farmers do is they use a blade plow to terminate cover crops. And a blade plow, or sometimes called a sweet plow undercutter or simply undercutter, basically severs the crop and any weeds just below the soil surface. So you're disturbing the soil only an inch or 2 deep, leaving 90% of the residue on the surface, protecting the soil, leaving most of the root biomass undisturbed in the soil profile so that it breaks down in the most beneficial way for soil health and soil structure. And I think that this is a really excellent tool, not only for dryland grain production, but for many other farming systems as well. And the project team is also looking at an economic evaluation of the benefits of costs of integrating that grazing phase into the rotation. And in orchards and vineyards, there's been some studies of how to establish things like brambles or blueberries and prevent weed competition and yet maintain soil health. It's known that when you keep the orchard floor bare or the the field bare when you're establishing a crop, it's very hard on soil health. It can cut your soil organic matter by half over about 10 years compared to keeping a low growing ground cover. But you don't want the ground cover right up against your planting stock when it's young and just getting established. So what the researchers, it was Dr. Bernadine Strick and David Bryla and colleagues, I believe either Oregon or Washington State University, they were looking at different ways to find the sweet spot between weed control and soil health management. And they found that weed mat was pretty good for getting the crop established and keeping the weeds down, and was much kinder to soil quality than just leaving the soil bare and tilling it. And then one of the farmers in the project came up with this really cool innovation where instead of having a solid strip of weed mat with a hole cut for your plant, they have an overlapping, what they call a zipper arrangement. So you have two strips of the weed mat. And what this does is it facilitates adding compost and other amendments, either for soil fertility or for maintaining soil health by adding organic matter. And then once this crop is well established, then you can more or less let the low growing vegetation cover the ground. And also there's some studies in Utah, orchards had the best soil health when you had bird's foot trefoil in the alleys and they were doing a mow and blow where the trefoil was mowed and the nitrogen-rich clippings were moved into the tree rows. And they also just found much better tree root growth when you had that living cover than when you had either an organic mulch or a synthetic mulch, or the bare soil was again the worst. Okay, I turn it back over to Alice, and
Okay.
the hour.
Hi, thank you, Mark.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me. Oh, good. Okay. We're now going to move on to our Q&A. So if you have a question, you can just type it into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll be reading the questions out loud until we run out of time. So for about half an hour or so. If you don't see the Q&A box, there should be a black bar with some controls at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on the Q&A one, that should pull it up. I also want to mention that this presentation is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording in about a week on the eOrganic YouTube channel, maybe give or take a few days for the Thanksgiving break. We'll also be sending you a short survey by email later today, and so we'd very much appreciate your feedback about the webinar. So moving on to the questions, you mentioned some NOP acceptable herbicides and other cultivation and independent weed control methods. Can you speak to the cost effectiveness of any of these? You mentioned that you didn't think they were so effective. Do you have any information on that?
Specifically I was mostly referring to the organic herbicides. These are based on either acetic acid or on essential oils, which have kind of a non-specific burn down effect on vegetation. And they're not as effective nor as selective as the synthetic herbicides. And I believe probably their best use would be as a supplemental strategy. And they do run fairly expensive. So it would probably cost more to treat an acre with an NOP allowed herbicide than it would to do something like Roundup or glyphosate. I'm just grabbing a catalog from a local organic products to see if I can just get a few specific examples of these herbicides. But anyway, go ahead with the next question, and I'll be looking these up.
Okay, so you talked earlier about the potato rotation with red clover, and before that cereal winter grains. In that rotation, is the red clover enough to diminish the wireworms that are so attracted to our grass type crops?
That is a good question. Wireworms, that's now that was just an example rotation. It's not one that I studied extensively, but I have seen some studies that show that potatoes respond positively to wet red clover, that in addition to the nitrogen, that there can be a beneficial soil microbial effect. But if you have wireworm, I'm not sure what that is a good question. Wireworms in potato rotation. I don't believe that clover specifically inhibits wireworm, but oh, here's a few herbicides: Eco Blend, grass and weed killer, Axe broad spectrum insecticide, Avenger broad spectrum. That's citrus oil. The mostly I was in love with the group was the ammoniated soaps of fatty acids, which are also allowed. And corn glutenil is another one, which both provides nitrogen and tends to suppress weeds. There's a 30% acetic acid product. You have to handle that with care. It's quite caustic. It's 6 times as concentrated as regular vinegar. So yeah, there's a few examples there.
Okay, let's see. If a site has yellow nutsedge, would solarization kill the tuber?
That is a good question. It may be difficult because the tubers can occur as low as 4 or 5 inches below the surface. However, yellow nutsedge will be more responsive to solarization than its heat-loving cousin, the purple nutsedge, which may be present in the southern part of the western region. Purple nutsedge can resprout from tubers as deep as 10 inches and can take temperatures as high as 125 degrees or something like that. So extremely hard to manage purple nutsedge with heat. Yellow nutsedge, I would say it's probably worth a try. Other strategies might be to take a field cultivator and bring as many of those tubers to the surface as possible, get them dried out, or that repeated shallow tillage that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, let's see.
So on nutsedge,
okay.
just interesting here, I just noticed this in the
Sure.
catalog. Blackstrap molasses is probably not something you can do on a large scale, but it has been found that it fires up microbes in the soil that will attack the nutsedge. This is probably better for yellow nutsedge again. I don't know. It's just something I just happened to see there, and you were talking about yellow nutsedge, so.
Sounds good. Okay, so according to strategy 9 that you mentioned before, if you want to establish a self-seeding cover, we may need to ring roll or graze in order to reintegrate seeds before the winter and early spring scavenging by insects and rodents.
Oh, the one about leaving the residues on the surface. I'm sorry, run that question by me again.
Okay, yeah, it was strategy 9. I don't remember which one was strategy 9. We can kind of look back in a second.
That's the weed seed predation, I believe.
Oh, okay. So if you want to establish a self-seeding cover, we might need to ring roll or graze in order to reintegrate seeds before the winter and early spring scavenging by insects and rodents.
Oh. Okay, now did not actually discuss self-seeding covers. That is an interesting question. Of course, you'll want to manage those in a way that will protect them from predators and get them established. It almost seems like this question bridges 2 different strategies. One is tilling in a broadcast cover crop and taking out the weed seeds, which was under, I think, strategy 8. That was the stale seed bed. The answer will depend on where you are in the rotation and what you want to grow and what you don't want to grow. So I think we're kind of looking at 2 different situations here. One where you have a cover crop that has winter killed and it probably has not set its own seed. And you want to leave that untilled in most circumstances. Whereas if you have, for instance, if there had been a cover crop that self-seeded and you wanted to be sure it comes up again, then a ring roller or a very light tillage might be appropriate.
Okay. Let's see. You mentioned a Cornell study on weeds and compost.
Yes.
With the high analysis compost or manure application used in that study, was the increased response due to fast release nitrogen or over application of nitrogen and phosphorus, or both?
Well, it was interesting because they found that the response to the compost was greater than response to either the nitrogen or the potassium added individually as feather meal or potassium sulfate, respectively. And I want to point out this was not a matter of weed seeds brought in by the compost. It was a matter of stimulation of the existing weed seed bank. Um, and it appears that sometimes these weeds will respond to all the nutrients given together more dramatically than they will to any one nutrient. And one thing about piling up that phosphorus is you reduce the mycorrhizal population, and that could subtly shift the balance of power in favor of the weeds.
Okay. Has any work been done that you know of with strawberry production with a strip-till or no-till system?
Very good question. I don't know of any specifically. I know that there's an extensive strawberry study ongoing, UC Santa Cruz, Carol Shannon, and others. I would refer the uh, person who's asking this question to that lab and find out if they know of any. I know that strawberries are very often produced in plastic culture, and that is a system that definitely has its own soil health challenges.
Okay. How well does cover cropping work for arid regions for managing weeds, where an annual rainfall, for example, is about 7 inches?
Good question. That is something I'm on the learning curve, and I am intending to learn more about that between now and when it's time to do the cover crop uh, webinar in this series. I know that in the semi-arid regions of the northern Great Plains, where it's more like 10 to 12 inches, they found that winter pea, I'm not sure if it was Austrian winter pea or other varieties, but it's definitely that cool season pea in the same species with English shell peas and snow peas, that had a greater water use efficiency and a greater ability to fix nitrogen and provide some weed competition when planted as a winter green manure. Um, and there's two different kind of categories of drought tolerant cover crops. At the one extreme, you have ones that are drought tolerant because they have a deep, massive root system and they're really good at extracting moisture. And that is a drawback because that's where you use up the soil moisture throughout the profile. Examples would be alfalfa, and winter rye does that as well. And on the other hand, there are some crops that are drought resistant and very frugal in their use of water. Pearl millet is example. Most of the millets are more in that category. And apparently the winter pea, even though I think of peas as a cool season, moist climate type plant, it appears to work very well in some of these northern Great Plains and interior Pacific Northwest situations. So that is a question that I will explore in more depth between now and show time for the cover crops.
Okay, which is coming up in February. Um,
Okay.
yeah, and in the meantime, we'll also have one on practical conservation tillage for Western regions organic cropping systems on January 23rd. So it'll be the same link and you'll get a reminder. So hopefully you can all join us for that. So moving on to more questions here. Can you elaborate on bindweed control with galls? How is it encouraged and how effective is it?
Gall mite, I would have to look into that in more detail. Yeah, gall mite is an insect. Well, it's a mite actually. I think it's an arachnid. It's related to spider mites, but instead of being a pest of crops, it just specifically attacks the bindweed. Um, and I would have to go back and look up the exact. Uh, Actually, there will be some notes that go into much greater detail on the information, and I don't have it all committed to memory, but it will refer to the project that is looking at gall mite. There are actually a couple of my projects that are looking at gall mite as a biocontrol for bindweed. That one in the Pacific Northwest on horticultural woody perennial crops, and there's another one, the new one, the Creep Stop project, which is looking at integrated control of bindweed and Canada Thistle. For details on these biocontrols, I would just perhaps refer them to the project team of these projects that are doing this work, because this is kind of new, breaking news in the area of organic research.
Yeah, the results aren't in yet on that, but we will have more information as the project develops. Okay, what are some of the best self-reseeding cover crops, probably legumes, that are out there? Are there short season cover crops that can work in the northern Great Plains?
That are self-seeding. Interesting. Well, I know that crimson clover is pretty good for self-seeding. I'm not sure that it's that well adapted to the northern Great Plains, though. Again, it's another cover crop question. We'll just put it on the agenda. So,
okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, this person says she loved this presentation. Glad you could come.
oh, thank you.
You talked about bird's foot trefoil in orchards in the interrow. What types of cover crops in the alleys have been useful for pigweed and field bindweed?
For suppressing them.
Yep.
Cover crop to suppress. Now, is this again in orchard situations?
It seems like that's what she's asking about here.
Yeah, I would imagine that bird's foot trefoil may not be. Oh, that's a good question. Native perennial grasses. That's a good one too. I just saw that flash up on the screen. But to suppress, he said pigweed and bindweed. Add that to my cover crop list, I'm afraid, because see, one of the disadvantages of having an Appalachian person given these talks is although I did live in the West for a few years, I am not that familiar with the challenges of organic agriculture where it rains 10 inches a year.
We are going to have some co-presenters on some of the future webinars in the series who are from the West as well. So I just wanted to let everyone know that too.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so will steam killing weeds harm the soil organisms?
Good question. I know that, you see, the thing is, flame, which is even hotter and more intense than steam, that heat only goes a fraction of an inch into the soil. So right at the soil surface, you may have some heat impacts, but it will not be steep, deeper, or won't be deep or devastating to the soil profile. I would imagine the steam, it's such a brief flash of H2O vapor at 200, 250 degrees Fahrenheit that the other thing is, with both flame and steam, you're not looking to have the weed look dead as soon or singed as soon as you pass. You just want to give it enough heat that by the end of the day, its cells are starting to break down. So you really don't have to use that much heat. And besides, it wouldn't be very energy efficient or cost efficient to blast weeds hard enough to make them look singed or scalded immediately, or to affect the soil health, biota. It's a very good question. I mean, if you do have ground beetles running around on the surface or earthworms at the surface because it just rained like crazy, yeah, you probably will harm those critters. But anything that's even a half inch below the surface is probably safe.
Okay, in the chat box, there's a few questions as well. So that one about native California perennial grasses in areas which receive all their rainfall in the winter, like California. So has there been any work done with that?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
It's an excellent question. I would encourage the person who asked that to submit a proposal to OREI or to SARE.
Okay. And then we have a question about whether chicken manure is a health hazard to the crop being grown. So more of a general question about organic techniques.
Health hazard. The main health hazard with chicken manure would be a foodborne illness hazard. And there's pretty good evidence that if you at least follow the organic 120-day rule, you will greatly reduce. I mean, there's no such thing as zero risk, but you'll reduce your risk, your pathogen loads by 5 orders of magnitude in that 120 days. The risks directly to the plant, there are no plant pathogens in poultry litter that I know of. And the main thing is nutrient excess and imbalances, and that's just a matter of good nutrient management and calibrating your rates and your usage of the material. One other thing to remember is the poultry litter products that are sold as organic fertilizers have been heat treated so that there should be practically zero foodborne illness pathogens. And in fact, there's no application to harvest interval required for those materials. Anything that's hot composted above 140 degrees for 3 days, if it's hot composted enough to kill most of your weed seeds, then there's basically no human foodborne pathogens in it, nor should there be any plant pathogens.
Okay, another chicken question. What about the chickens grazing the weeds and the effect on the crop?
From that example, they saw improvements in both cover crop biomass and cash crop yield. Now, again, you do need to watch the soil phosphorus. You don't want that getting above the optimum range because then you start losing your highly important mycorrhizal fungi from the soil food web. But within the parameters of good nutrient management, as long as you have that 120-day interval between when the chickens are running there and when you're picking your organic food crop, especially important for anything that's normally eaten raw, like a salad green. Like you wouldn't want to run the chickens and then immediately plant baby lettuce that's harvested 30 days later. That would be quite a risk. So that is one thing to keep in mind. But since those chickens are grazing on the cover crop and then the cover crop was allowed to regrow for several months after that, you would have complete attenuation of those pathogens.
Okay. Okay.
What do you consider an optimal phosphorus level? I would say if between medium and high on a soil test, like whatever your soil lab considers medium or high, in combination with a good soil food web is about what you want to strive for. If you get to very high, then you start to suppress the mycorrhizal fungi. That's just from what I know so far. There probably needs to be more research to fine tune that optimum. But I mean, I garden on a soil that's low in phosphorus on the soil test. But every time I take a plant tissue analysis, the phosphorus is right smack in the middle of sufficiency range, which tells me I've got a strong soil food web and enough mycorrhizal fungi to give the plants what they need. Now, I'm not in commercial production, so there could be some slight yield limitation there, but I've always been impressed at how well the plants do in a low phosphorus soil when you got good biological activity.
Okay, going back to a question that I missed that was submitted before, it says, with regards to turning under cover crops, is it better to plow them under and establish a seed bed to plant or transplant within a 1 or 2 week period, or use a longer 6 to 8 week intervening period to allow for 1 or 2 stale seed bed cultivations and enough time for the decomposition of the cover crop to prevent green bridge problems related to root disease?
Oh, that's a long question.
But yeah, I can ask the part one at a time there if you want, but yeah, so.
Okay, this is enough for a whole other webinar, but it's a great question.
Okay, so
Well,
I guess, yeah, he's talking about timing, like
I would say that, boy, if you can get away from the moldboard plow, it's so much kinder to the soil. I mean, look at that. Check out the sweet plow undercutter. Another approach to cover crop management is strip tillage, mow the cover crop or roll crimp it, and then till up, clear up a very narrow swath to get your seed bed. It depends on what you're planting. If you're planting a crop, you know, that's direct seeded and you're planting in multiple rows, yeah, you got to make a seed bed of some sort. But there are many, I mean, one option I would look at if you need to terminate a cover crop and leave a good seed bed is the rotary spader or reciprocating spader. Spading machines incorporate considerable biomass, they leave you a good seed bed, and they don't invert the soil, and they don't beat the soil up nearly as much as a rototiller. And the researchers up in Washington State have been looking at vegetable rotations with either a spader or moldboard plow and disc, and they get much less soil compaction and sometimes better yields. Now, this green bridge on the root disease, that's a really good question. Many root diseases are enough specific by plant family or plant species that just a good crop rotation. And sometimes the selection of the right cover crop will actively suppress certain pest nematodes or root diseases. Now, there are circumstances where you want to break a green bridge for one reason or another. But on the other hand, for the most part, the tighter your crop rotation and the more diverse, the better your soil health, the less your production problems, weeds, pests, diseases, drought, etc., will be. Again, with that caveat that when you got limited rainfall, you need to be a bit strategic. There may need to be times when you just have a dead residue covering the soil to let it recharge moisture for a while. But for the most part, the more you can narrow those bare soil periods between a cover crop and the next production crop, or vice versa, the less niche you're going to leave for weeds, and the more you're going to be building soil health. But that is a really good question, green bridge and carrying over disease. You'd have to know what specific disease you're dealing with. And then you can say, okay, well, this disease attacks both rye and tomato. So I either want to not grow tomato after rye, use a different cover crop, or I do want a long interval where that rye has a chance to really break down and the disease is interrupted. I mean, an example is you don't want clovers in the cover crop ahead of tomato, because if you're in a root knot nematode region, root knot nematodes love both clover and tomato. So that would be a case where you might want to choose a winter cover crop that won't support those nematodes.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one final question. So there was one put in the chat box here. It says, let's remember to treat our farms and gardens like an ecosystem and keep the soil armored with living roots in the soil at all times. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I am such a believer of living roots now. There was this excellent review article that explored the potential for breeding and selecting crops for deeper and more extensive root systems. I mean, it is to the point where, you know, I used to go through my garden and just rip out spent vegetables. And now if I think about it, I say, no, don't rip the root system out. Just cut it at the surface. If you got tops that you need to compost, cut the tops off, leave the roots to decay in place. And living roots, yeah, get something growing as soon as you can. But yes, looking at the farm as a whole ecosystem is really vital. And even in the dry regions like Northern Great Plains, there seems to be a paradoxical situation where the more cover crop biomass and the more diversity you have, the better your soil health. And in the long run, you end up with more soil moisture storage. But you do have that short-term risk or investment or cost of using moisture to grow the cover crop. And that's what I need to study up on in more depth between now and February, is what are the best cover crops for getting the most soil health for the least water use.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your excellent questions. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we did record this webinar, so you'll find the recording within 1 to 2 weeks at most on the eOrganic YouTube channel. And the slide handout is available at the link on your screen, along with some presentation notes. And the OFRF soil health guides, one of which is about weed management, is also freely available to the public. So thank you again, Mark, for an excellent
Welcome.
presentation. And we hope that all of you can join us for the rest of the webinars in this series. You should be getting reminders about them, and it should be the same link. So thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.